Good afternoon. I hope everyone is doing well. Welcome to the ESCP webinar on Principles for Sustainable Virtual Working During and Post-COVID-19. My name is Hannah Hayworth, and I'm currently the Program Manager for the MSc in Digital Project Management and Consulting. I would like to present our speaker today, Professor Dr. Petros Chamakiotis, who will be the Scientific Director of the MSc from September onward. Petros is an Associate Professor of Management at ESCP Business School in Madrid, and he is currently the chair of the EFIP Working 9.5 on our digital lives. He joined ESCP from the UK, where he most recently taught at the University of Sussex Business School. Previously, he was a postdoctoral researcher at Royal Holloway, University of London, following his PhD at the University of Bath. Broadly speaking, Petros specializes in how technology influences the practice of management and has been investigating virtual working practices for over a decade. His latest article in this area, which he will be drawing on in this webinar, was published by the LSE Business Review on April 16th. He also has expertise in the management of ubiquitous connectivity and the social value of digital platforms and health apps. His research has been published in relevant information systems and management journals and has been funded by prestigious funders such as the British Academy. During this webinar, there will be opportunities to ask any questions by posting them in the questions window. We encourage you to participate so that you get the most out of this session. Thank you and enjoy the webinar. Petros, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you very much, Hannah, for the nice introduction. Welcome everybody to this webinar. I will try to share my screen, so I'm assuming that it works fine for everybody. Let me know if not. Right, so this is a webinar on the principles for sustainable virtual working during and post-COVID-19. It is a pleasure to be able to speak to you about one of my favorite topics. It's a topic, not the COVID part, but the virtual working part. It's a topic of interest, and I've been studying how people work in virtual environments for over a decade overall. This is a summary of what Hannah mentioned as to my current role and my career history. And these are some of the places online where I can be found. I encourage you to follow on Twitter, which I use for academic purposes, and I often share research findings and issues of interest to people that work virtually and they use digital technologies in a variety of different sectors. And this is my contact information for those of you who want to get in touch after the webinar. Right, we're going to start off with a very quick brainstorming session, and I'm hoping the technology will work. I'm going to pose a question so that you can share some answers based on your current understanding of what are the main characteristics of the virtual working environment that everybody speaks about. We hear primarily due to COVID-19 and the subsequent lockdown that we have been experiencing for the last couple of months in many countries across the world. Many of us have had to move from the traditional working environment to the virtual working environment. So I wonder what, in your experience, whether you have experience working virtually or not, what do you think are some of the main characteristics that make virtual working different to traditional working? I wonder if you can use the question box and share some of your thoughts with us. And I'm going to try to retrieve the answers. I'm hoping this is not very early. Okay. Okay, thank you, Spiros, for, okay, thank you, Anna. Flexibility, nonverbal communication, different time zones. Excellent. These are indeed some of the characteristics that make it different to what we're accustomed to. I'm going to start off with a word cloud that essentially synopsizes and synthesizes some of the different terms that have been used in the literature in the area of information systems and management to refer essentially to this new working environment, which is not as new as we think. We know that people have been working virtually for over 2 decades, essentially, and there have been different terms that scholars and practitioners have used to refer to those environments. Some of them, as we see here in the word cloud, are new ways of working, virtual teams. We have a lot of acronyms, as you may see. We have CMC, which stands for computer-mediated communication. We have VPTs for virtual project teams. What else? We have the new normal, someplace here, which is what the media tend to talk about these days. So what I want to highlight here is that, of course, we have all those new terms that sound interesting and relevant. The question is, are they synonyms? Do they mean the same thing for everybody? And the answer to that is that probably not. They differ from one another depending on the specific characteristics that characterize the different environments. But they all have two things in common. So the two things that those terms have in common are one, the aspect of dispersion. We're all dispersed in different locations, and the aspect of technology mediation. So nothing would have been possible without the technology in place. There are two reasons why we study this now, and why this has become such a topical and such a relevant issue, not only in academic terms, but also in the practitioner world, more importantly, and also in the media and the popular press. One is the lockdown. Evidently, everybody has had to transition from a traditional working environment into a virtual working environment overnight, and that is what makes it so different and so relevant. This is a visual representation, if you like, of the main characteristic of work, the main characteristics rather of work as we knew it to date. So we knew that work for knowledge workers, for example, has been traditionally office-based. So we have a certain number of characteristics that make it make it what it is, essentially, which are the well-defined boundaries. So in other words, in an office environment, we have a clear boundary. We are in the office. We have a clear boundary in terms of location. We're typically in the office, depending on the job we do, from 9 to 5. So we have a standard, well-defined temporal boundary as well. We also have physical co-location. We sit next to our co-workers and our colleagues. As a result, we have face-to-face communication. If I want to say something to somebody, I just say it verbally. They might be sitting next to me. And we have an established social context, so we know who our colleagues are. We probably see them very regularly on a daily basis. We know stuff that is not explicitly related to work, but goes beyond the work domain. So these are some of the characteristics of work as we knew it, the traditional working environment, as I call it in this presentation. Now that changes, and what changes is that all this is not there anymore, but instead we have what we saw on the previous slide, which we're calling the virtual working environment, or working virtually or remotely, or whatever term you prefer to use. And as I said before briefly, there are two characteristics that make this environment special. And those characteristics are the dispersion aspect. Dispersion can be geographical, it can be temporal, if we live in a different time zone and yet we have to work in the time zone of a different country. And they are locational as well. The other characteristic is the technology. So technology plays a huge role in enabling and actually enhancing, in certain occasions, the work that we do. Now, it is important to know that, and before I move on to the next slide, why is it necessary to study this now? We know that there's a literature on virtual working that spans, it's a 2-decade-old literature, and we know that people have been working in this manner for a long time. But what is the difference now? I would argue that there are certain advantages that we haven't really exploited in this current context. And although some of us may have been accustomed to working virtually, at least partially, during our careers, we don't realize certain advantages that we have in this current lockdown context, which will be discussed in the next few minutes. What I'm arguing is that although the last couple of months have been effective for a vast majority of people worldwide in terms of transitioning from the traditional to the digital, we do not really know if that is sustainable. And there's a lot of discourse currently in a variety of different contexts, in a variety of different countries and different sectors as to how this can be sustainable. So the presentation that I'm delivering today in this webinar is essentially based on the 4 principles that I have elicited from a number of years of work in this area that can help us create the necessary conditions for sustainable virtual working. And by that I mean sustainable virtual working over time, not just for 2 months of lockdown, which is where we are right now. So to give you an overview of the 4 principles before we get started in more detail, principle number 1 is about maintaining a social context. I said before that those of us who had been working in a face-to-face manner in the so-called office, we have an established social context with our colleagues. And this is one of the advantages that we have during our transition into the virtual working environment. The next principle is about the right technologies. And of course, some of us have our favorite technologies. Some technologies don't really work. They present problems. But what is the right technology? Is there a right technology that can be adopted? And if so, what is that? The 4th principle is about leading teams virtually. And of course, we have a huge body of literature on the topic of leadership and leadership theory that tells us how teams are led and how organizations are led. But how relevant is all that in the current context? Does it mean, for example, that an experienced manager in the traditional environment has the same ability to deliver the same results in the virtual environment, or do we need to modify anything? And the 5th and last principle is about creating new work-life boundaries. And this is here to highlight that it's not just about work itself, but it is rather about A, delivering the tasks that we have to deliver at work, and B, maintaining a sense of work-life balance and personal sense of well-being during this, call it a lockdown or working from home mode that applies to some of us at present. So this is a quick overview of 4 principles. And I'm going to start off with a few more details about the first, about the importance of having a virtual social context. And the importance of having a virtual social context is essentially paramount. We have seen in the research literature that the teams that have an established social context, they work better over time. And that is because they have the ability to develop trust. In other words, if you know your colleague personally and not just as a worker, then it is likely that you will trust them more easily. And that over time creates a more constructive and more effective environment for work. This study here, I think it comes from an interview from this academic that I had cited, suggests that developing common values and objectives is what brings and glues, if you like, a virtual team together and makes it effective over time and through the bad times. And as we have seen here from the academic literature as well, trust develops most effectively as a result of shared experiences and rich interaction contexts that allows a deeper interface and interdependence. Now, what this means in layman's terms is that we have to develop a social context. We have to know the other person, not only within the work domain, but to know them as a person. And the virtual social context in which we find ourselves right now is very special because transitioning from the traditional to the virtual means that we already have that context in place. So the question is about not creating a social context, but about maintaining it. And it is important to maintain that by using the right technologies. If we can't see our colleagues face to face, what are the right technologies that can enable us to maintain, in essence, the social context that we need to have in place? I wonder again if in the window box, as before, if you can identify some of the different types of technologies that you have personally been using for different purposes, and if you can actually share them for discussion. Okay. So I have 2 questions actually. I have a question about the different types. And the illustration I have on the left side of the slide is to help you identify some of the different technologies that we may be using. Okay, we have Skype, Hangouts, Skype for Business, Microsoft Teams. Right, so, right. Okay, collaborative tools, Dropbox, Drive, Zoom. Okay, just one person out of the 15, 20 people that have shared responses has mentioned a non-synchronous technology. So I will explain what that means right now. What we know is that there are essentially two types of technologies that we can use to support virtual working. They are pretty evident, but they're a bit obscured in the illustration as well. So there are synchronous technologies, and that means they are technologies that allow for real-time communication. And this application that we're using right now for this webinar, as an example, the GoToWebinar application is one of them, because it allows for real-time synchronous communication, and not only communication, but also collaboration. And of course, you mentioned some of them. You mentioned Microsoft Teams, you mentioned Skype, Skype for Business, and Google Hangouts, and a number of other synchronous technologies that have this ability. Now, people tend to have a preference toward synchronous technologies, especially nowadays. That wasn't the case a few years back. And that is obviously because of the fact that synchronous technologies are the best in terms of transmission of cues and in terms of making the other person feel like we're face-to-face talking. Of course, it's not as rich as a face-to-face environment, but it's the closest you can get with a synchronous technology. And that is why people prefer them over asynchronous technologies, which is the second type of technologies that I have identified for this webinar, which offer non-real-time communication and collaboration. Now, the relevant theory, for those of you who are familiar with the information systems field, you may know that this is the media synchronicity theory, which is very useful in the current context because it saves time and it helps us be more effective, more productive, and it protects our work-life boundaries as well. So that theory suggests that yes, we have some technologies that are more synchronous than others. They enable close to face-to-face communication through a digital technology, and we have asynchronous technologies such as the email, for example, or a storage space, an online storage space like Dropbox or like Box or some other technology. Now, the question is that those different technologies should be used for different purposes. So to the question, are there right technologies to be used? I'm not sure if there's a right and a single right technology that can be suggested. But what I know and I can recommend is that people should use different technologies depending on the purpose. I'll give you an example. An example is if there's a brainstorming session, or if there's evidently a webinar like now, it makes sense to use something that can enable this interaction real time. Therefore, in those cases where a brainstorming, a meeting has to take place, or some other activity that requires people to exchange ideas in real time, then a synchronous technology is best. That serves best if we want to socialize as well. We can have a virtual coffee with our colleagues, for example. It's not necessary that we restrain our meetings, that we limit them to work activities. We can actually incorporate some social aspects in them. Asynchronous technologies, on the other hand, are best for different purposes. So if we want to share something with somebody, or if we want to keep track of the minutes of the meeting or something else, maybe an email is best. Or if we want to have visibility over what the rest of the team is doing, maybe an asynchronous online drive works best. So although we tend to use synchronous technologies for pretty much everything, some of us, they are not always the best solution. And what I want to argue is that be clever as to what technology you use, when, and how. It might be much more effective for you to use an asynchronous technology for different purposes. And that takes us to the third principle, which is about the topic of leadership. And again, like before, I want to encourage you to think and share based on your own experiences. How do you think leadership is different in the virtual context? Do you think it is different, first of all, or do you think it's exactly the same? And we can copy paste identical practices that we know from the face-to-face working environment and apply them to the virtual working environment. If they're different, what are the new leadership theories and practices that you can think of? In simple words, how do you lead a team virtually? Do you do anything different? Let's see if we have any suggestions in the question box. Okay. Okay, list meetings. Right. Okay. Just I skipped a question from before. What are the asynchronous technologies? Some examples asked by Hadrib. Yeah, I think I covered that by mentioning things like Dropbox or online servers, or even the email, which is an example of an asynchronous technology. Okay. In regards to the question about leadership, face-to-face is easier to discuss with colleagues. Yes. Follow up more formally in a meeting. Sanya. Okay. Control concept changes drastically. Correct. That's all correct. More communication by Natalia. All right. Okay. It's more responsibility. Exactly. More responsibility, which means, is there enough time? And that raises a very good question, actually. Is there enough time to essentially lead a large team of people? Say you have a team of 20 people dispersed across different locations. How easy is it to do that virtually? And yes, we have some examples. We have research that shows clearly that leadership is different indeed. One of the key messages, and probably before I show this slide, one of the key messages is that the leader of a virtual team has to deal with centrifugal forces, if you like, the forces that pull the team apart. And those centrifugal forces are the time differences for those that have time differences between their colleagues. Or it could be the fact that you don't actually see the other person, you don't see one another, and that makes it harder to see what they're doing, essentially. Not exclusively for monitoring purposes, but for any other purpose. And it is really hard for one single person to devote the time needed to supervise or to lead or to manage a large number of people that are dispersed and whom you can't really see in a face-to-face environment, let alone now that you can't see them at all with the uncertainty that the COVID lockdown has brought about. Therefore, yes, it is possible to have a centered leader still, a person that has the, if you like, the formal responsibility of the team in a virtual environment. And the differentiating element is that may not be enough. So a good example of a different leadership style that we see in virtual teams is that of the shared leadership, or e-leadership for electronic. And this comes from a study that I did back in 2010, when the topic of virtual teams was not as popular, if you like, as it is nowadays. So what we found back then was that in the high-tech organization that we studied, that there was a shared leadership approach whereby, in addition to the centered leader that had the overall formal responsibility for the project, we had different types of shared leaders that shared the leadership of the project as the project went on and developed further. So in this particular example, as per the illustration that I have, the first phase of the project, if you like, took place in the United States, where the company's creative team was based, and that means that they were the people that generated the ideas, and they took the lead at the very first phases of the project. And that then was taken over by they handed over the leadership of the team to the UK guys in well, I shouldn't reveal the location, but in the UK, where the coordination promotion team was in place. And that subgroup, if you like, of the team became the leader of the whole project for a certain duration of time. And they handed over the leadership to the Austrian guys, where the ideas were actually manufactured. And then they gave the leadership back to the UK guys for further coordination. So what we see here is a shared leadership framework whereby leadership moves from one person or from one subgroup to the other as the project unfolds. And this is one of the differentiating elements of what leadership looks like in the virtual environment. I have to say this is not the only style that we know, but it is one of the prominent leadership styles that we see in virtual teams across industries. And that was the fourth principle about leadership: to adopt and to be able to develop a leadership style that suits the task and the team and the people of the team best. The fourth principle that I argue is a necessary one in order to keep a virtual team together over time has to do with the sense of work-life balance. That's the sense of maintaining your work-life boundaries, if you like, or the sense of keeping some sort of distinction and maintaining some sort of distinction between what we refer to as work and what we refer to as non-work or personal life or social life or as life outside work. And of course, it's much more challenging in this current context to discern work from non-work, especially if you don't have a special space in your home that is dedicated to work, which many of us didn't. And often work and non-work seem blended. And that has an impact on how we feel. Do we feel well? And there are 4 strategies that I have identified which can actually help not only to restore a sense of work-life boundary, a sense of work-life balance, but to keep us to help us separate the two in a way that suits us and works best for us. Because at the end of the day, as we said, it's not only about achieving our work targets, but it's also about maintaining our personal well-being. The first strategy I have identified is about deciding where to work in our homes. There are certain rules that people apply. For example, not doing work in the bedroom, and that places a spatial or a physical, if you like, boundary within our homes. So we may have a dedicated space in which we conduct our work, and that's the only space within our homes where we're allowed to do work. So deciding that what that space is helps us recreate a boundary that doesn't really exist, but we create it ourselves within our homes. It's not a geographical boundary that is. It is similar to what we had before, but it's the closest you can get. The second type of boundary that can be introduced in this context is deciding when to work. So in addition to setting a physical boundary, you can also establish a temporal boundary. In other words, working from home is seen as a very flexible way of working, and that means that you could break the day into 2 halves, and you can work 4 hours in the early morning, and then 4 hours in the late evening, as long as that doesn't present problems for the nature of your work that you do. But deciding when to work and setting clear boundaries as to when the beginning and the end of each time frame within which you work can become a very good way of maintaining some sense of work-life balance. The third strategy in this regard is about deactivating or silencing notifications. We often have our phones full of notifications, people sending us WhatsApp messages, messages from social media. At the same time, we have work emails and we have the phone ringing all the time. As you can see in this illustration here, there are numerous notifications on this phone that you can see on the left side of your screens. There are 31 emails. There are 3 missed calls. There are 12 written messages, text messages. How stressful can be that? So deactivating the notifications altogether, or at least silencing them so that we don't get the interruptions when you don't want them, can become very helpful. And the fourth and last strategy that can actually help restore our work-life boundaries is about having different devices for different purposes. What this means is that we can have a work laptop, and that could be the only digital artifact where we conduct work from home. And then we can have other technologies, for example, our personal tablet, which is exclusively used for non-work purposes. So making that distinction, that technological boundary distinction, can also be equally helpful. So there's no right or wrong when it comes to solutions, but I have identified those 4 strategies that can essentially help with the creation or the restoration, if you like, of new or existing work-life boundaries, respectively, that you can use as you see fit yourselves in your own lives. This is a slide that brings everything together, what we discussed. It is about the 4 principles on which this webinar is based, and with the main, if you like, lessons that you could take away from this. So just to recap, the first principle is about maintaining an existing virtual social context that we have from the face-to-face environment, and that is about maintaining the relationships that we have with our colleagues, and that can be done by having regular encounters online using certain technologies before or after the online meetings that we had scheduled for our day. The second one is about the right technology, and I think the distinction here between synchronous and asynchronous and the different purposes that those types of technologies might serve is what makes us essentially decide, okay, what is the right technology for this particular task? I'm going to use that instead of, for example, spending unnecessarily long hours in a synchronous meeting that can actually be summed up in a different way. The third one is about the alternative leadership styles, and today we have covered that of shared leadership, which is a third, and we have touched on the first one, which is about centered leadership, which is one style that we know from the traditional management theory. And at the end of the day, this is just to give you a snippet of what theory suggests in these areas, but I've tried my best to cover what I thought was an important summary of what we know and what can be applicable to this particular context. And last but not least was the discussion on the 4 strategies that can help us create new types of work-life boundaries, deciding where to work, when to work, deactivating or silencing our notifications, and using different devices for different purposes. And this brings this presentation to a close. Before presenting the last slide, I want to say that this drew on an article that I recently published, which you can find here. It is very easy to find by just typing the title of this article, which is How to Go Virtual as Efficiently and Painlessly as Possible. And the article was published in the LSE Business Review on April 16th, last month. And you have the direct link on your screens if you want to take a quick screenshot or if you want to type it to copy paste it somehow. This is a list of recommended references, and I do encourage whoever has an interest in learning more about this field and this line of research to again take a screenshot and to explore the references that you can see on your screen right now. And this is all from me. Thank you so much, and over to Hannah.
I thank you so much, Petros. It was a really excellent webinar and super interesting with so much new information about what we can apply to particularly our situation right now. So thank you so much to all of you who have joined us today and for your participation. We have an opportunity now if any of you have any further questions that you would like to ask Petros. I'm sure that you do, and please feel free to participate. And in the future, please feel free to also join any of our future ESCP webinar masterclasses. So thank you so much, Petros, and thank you to everyone else as well.
Thank you, Hannah, and thank you everybody for listening. Okay, we have a few questions. All right, from Benedict. Brainstorming, in some cultures, a lot of the exploring work goes by informal and spontaneous conversation in the office, cafeteria, or hallways. Yes. Do you have any concern and suggestion as to how to nurture this important part of work? Yes, exactly. That's a tough one, and I think cultural differences. I would encourage you to have a look at one of the articles that I have suggested, and I'm gonna post it here in a minute, which talks exactly about that. It's included in the reference list that I have posted on the penultimate slide of our colleague Xander and her colleagues, which talks explicitly about cultural differences. And there's a separate body of literature that explores exactly that, how to deal with cultural differences and how to enable people to be as effective as possible and to essentially mitigate the effects that the virtual environment poses, and to make it work for the team's benefit. I would stress the importance of maintaining a social context, which is the first principle of the 4 that I have identified. And I would say that it is exactly that, maintaining the social context and simulating the face-to-face communication that you can have in the hallway or in the office in a synchronous technology environment. And that's my quick advice, if you like, to respond to your question, quick question. Okay. We have another few questions. Yes, I will put back the list on the of the readings in a minute. I can actually do it right now, so you can take a quick look. Okay, so I'm hoping you can all see. So the article that touches on the cultural issues is the one that appears last, from Xander and her colleagues in 2013. And there are more items that can be of use. Okay, which method can be applied in collaboration on remote project management by Marie? Okay, I'm not sure, Marie, what you mean by method. What method exactly? Do you mean what technology or what project management theory? I'm not really clear. If you can clarify what you mean, I should be able to help more. Okay, another question. Okay. How can the shared e-leadership be applied to academia? That's a very good question. Okay, what I have been doing myself, and I think it works well, is that the shared leadership in the academic context, so when we write papers, for example, with our colleagues, can be best applied by dividing say you have a paper that you're working on with a team. It can be divided by having somebody take the lead on the methodological aspects of the paper. So somebody takes care of the methodology, or if somebody has a very strong quantitative background, they take care and they become the leaders of the quantitative component of the study, and you have the qualitative person be the leader of the qualitative component. Similarly, depending on the strengths and the weaknesses of each team member, you can assign, or not necessarily assign, but you can allow people to emerge naturally as leaders, and they can share the leadership of the paper, of the project, of the study, the way they see fit. Very common ways of doing that is dividing it by methodology / versus something else, or by the quant versus the qual parts of the study. And that's been my experience. Okay, technologies by Marie. Okay. Again, it depends. This is my answer to Marie in relation to the technologies that that can be applied to project management, remote project management. Okay, so project management and collaboration within a project management environment is a very diverse set of activities and tasks and things that have to be accomplished. So building on what I said previously about the distinction between synchronous and asynchronous technologies, I would suggest that depending on the very purpose of the task at hand, that you adopt the right technology. A number of things can be completed asynchronously. Even creativity, we have seen, and this is, I'm not sure if I have this paper of mine here, this is in my 2013 paper in a journal called Creativity and Innovation Management. So you can look it up by just Googling my name and Creativity and Innovation Management as a journal. We found that even creative tasks can be accomplished online in an asynchronous manner. So we have seen when we have participants that are dispersed in different locations, say that somebody was in the study very creative at night, and they were able to share their ideas asynchronously by creating the relevant documentation and the relevant notes in an online server, and then the rest of the team could pick them up the next morning and build on those ideas and come up with better and bigger and more useful ideas. So we saw how creativity developed in an asynchronous technology, which contradicts other studies that suggest that creativity has to be face-to-face, and we have to simulate a face-to-face environment virtually. So I would suggest that think about the task and the requirements of the task. Think about the people and their ability to use different technologies and their preferences as well, and make the technology selection fit the team. I cannot provide a right or wrong answer, or I cannot say that this is the right technology for project management. It would be too vague. We'll have a few other questions. Okay. Okay, by Almudena, what would you suggest to people concerned with privacy? Okay, so privacy is an issue. Informal face-to-face interaction at work can be felt as much more private than online ones. What can be done to measure people? That's a difficult question, Almudena. The privacy issue is one that concerns me pretty much myself. And I have to say that I'm very careful, and I tend to advise people to think of the GDPR and how those things play out in the online environment. I would suggest using synchronous technologies for informal chats because that feels more natural, and using encrypted servers and ensuring that the places, the online storage places on which we store files, that they have the relevant encryption in place, which is required by law. And I think places like, without the intention of advertising or promoting, but servers like box.com or other types of asynchronous technologies do have the necessary encryption policies in place. Okay, by Brajesh, what are your thoughts on shift in virtual working industry globally in the next few months? I think definitely there's a lot of discourse in the popular press, in the media, not just in academia and the practitioner world, that part of the work will be taking place virtually from now on, and we have realized how much more we can do virtually. Our responsibility is to make sure that the virtual working mode, if you like, is a productive and pleasant one, and it's not one in which we are concerned about privacy or about people watching us or about increased monitoring by our employees, but we should make it, we're in the making of that currently, and I think we all have a responsibility of tailoring it to our needs and of making it an ethical and sustainable working environment. It is, I think it's absolutely certain that business travel will be reduced from now on, and I think it is very important that we, as I said, that we make the virtual environment fruitful, I would say, a fruitful and sustainable one for us in the future. Okay, do you feel companies in Spain have been positively surprised by the virtual work productivity due to the lockdown, or maybe there is not this positive aspect, or maybe they haven't really been surprised? What is your opinion about that? From Marta. Marta, I'm not sure. I haven't done any research to find out what the reaction in Spain in particular is. But what I can tell you is that yes, this is the new normal. It's not as new as we think of it, because as I said during the webinar, we have been working virtually. Personally, for example, as an academic, I've been accustomed to working virtually for a number of years, not for the entire week, but partially during the week. And this is not new to me, but this is, if you like, the new normal. And I think we should make it work. I have, on a personal level, outside research, I haven't. I think people have reacted positively to it. Okay, right. You're very welcome to those of you who share your appreciation. Okay, by Saurabh, we have a question, which is, which would be a better approach, virtual or face-to-face, for students at schools and colleges? Again, the higher education industry is one that has been affected tremendously by this, and we have had to switch and to transition ourselves from the online to the from the face-to-face to the online. So my opinion is that the university experience is a life experience, and that it cannot be replaced by virtual means, but it can certainly be complemented by them. And I would say that currently we're making the most of it. But I would not say either or. I would argue for a blended approach, which is what, for example, we as ESCP and also other schools are adopting currently. Okay, let me see if there are more questions that I haven't. If I have missed questions, because some of them were very similar, which I skipped, to questions that have been answered. So if I have missed any questions, just feel free to repost them, because I feel a bit lost in the chat box. Okay, a few thank you messages. Thank you as well. Right. Yeah, I think, yeah, you're very welcome. Okay, I think this is pretty much it. I think we've covered most questions. Thank you for attending. Right, I guess it's time to hand over to Hannah again. If Hannah is still around.
Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for all of your questions, everyone. They were very interesting, and for participating and for answering all of them, Petros. Your answers were very informative as well. So again, thank you guys for joining, and please keep an eye out for an email regarding this session and also future sessions that we will have available for you with ESCP. So thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.